The news came out of nowhere. BBC Two was getting a whole new look and feel. This was immediately acknowledged as a good thing, with the idents on all three remaining BBC channels ranging from old and stale, very, very old and extremely stale, or just plain shit. What we didn't necessarily expect was that after 27.5 years they were finally dropping the figure 2 that would be the channel's identity through at least 4 previous facelifts. In its place, nothing. That's not a good sign. Bladed 2, a term I'm certain I didn't coin, had been around so long it was all but immutable. It outlived its big brother, the Fluted 1, by 2 decades, and revisiting its history after the news of its demise, I realised something startling. It no longer looked like the number 2 to me. It looked like BBC 2. That particular shape, the thick, bold sans serif, the curve ending in a right angle on one end and making a sharp point at the other, it took genuine effort to remember that it was a number and not just a TV station logo. The Bladed 2 had been in use as a symbol for so long, it had transcended its original meaning and gained a new one. To take another example, the golden arches are definitely the letter M, but that's not the first notion placed in your head by the sight of it. The first involuntary thought when you see this symbol has something to do with terrible burgers. It still is the letter M, but its status as a letter of the alphabet is very much secondary to that as a signifier of horrible food and capitalist excess. The Bladed 2 achieved the same thing. When it was introduced, it was just the number 2. But as time went on and it gained more and more personality and was seen in increasingly outlandish guises and scenarios, the fact that this basic configuration of lines represents a number slowly but surely became secondary to the fact that this specific configuration of lines represents the television station BBC Two. I honestly thought it was too late to comfortably replace the bloody thing, even before I realised this semiotic mutation. Could the Bladed 2 be removed from the channel without the operation killing the patient? Could it forge an entirely new identity separate from its avatar and personality of nearly 3 decades? Early indications are that they can, because the new look seems to have gone down quite well. I like it. I like it a lot. The Bladed 2 is replaced by a self-described simple curve, a serpentine line, sometimes drawn in as a tangible line, and sometimes, possibly more often, purely perceptual as an edge. Although I'm not entirely sure what this one is. They've hidden the word sex in there. Is that an obscure Disney reference? I was unconvinced at first by basic description and still images because of its ambient stylings. It seemed as though the BBC were following channels 4 and 5 down the conceptual rabbit hole of idents without identification. But the curve is actually a stronger presence than I had expected, thanks to some stellar visual and sound design work. For the record, these were developed by BBC Creative in association with Super Union, a newish branding consultancy made by merging together 5 old ones, including the original Lambie Nairn company. I'd like to think of that as having a pleasing circularity to it, but to be honest, there's been so much corporate musical chairs over the years, including the small detail that Martin Lambie Nairn himself hasn't worked there in 10 years, that the Lambie Nairn connection is practically homeopathic. Still, it's good that they went with at least some outside input. BBC Creative working alone resulted in the oneness idents. As for the actual films themselves, they were made by various companies, including the Mill and the legendary Aardman Animations. There's even trailer stings. Okay, so they're just the idents with wipes added, but it's nice to see them anyway, as well as the endboards. I'd also like the conceit of having the text shift from serif to sans at the end. It's a small touch, but it keeps it visually interesting and draws the eye to the text without changing its content. It's interesting that the noisy, charismatic, extroverted Bladed 2 has been replaced with essentially nothing, just a geometric concept, but it's possible that only something like this could have worked, given how iconic the Bladed 2 was. No other variation on the number could have replaced it. Apart from anything else, there was nowhere else to go with the figure 2 that wouldn't have seemed like repetition. The curve evokes the idea of 2, both in shape and, thanks to its deployment bisecting the screen, in concept. It successfully takes on the Bladed 2's heavy load. How easy it's going to be to adapt to other media and contexts is another question. I assume the BBC have a plan. It's worth noting that at this point, 2 days into the new era, the official BBC 2 website still centres around the Bladed 2. The subtlety and combination of art and craft in these oddly reminds me of the channel's last identity before the Bladed 2, the Alan Cheap's stencilled letters logo. But these are much more interesting all round. There have been comparisons with the ambient looks of channels 4 and 5, of course, but these are superior in every way, especially to the channel 5 looks, because they do what idents are supposed to do. Stare at a single identifying mark and never look away. Cinematic techniques and visual grammar, full-blown films, don't work for idents because they're antithetical to the stated purpose. Idents are supposed to identify. That's why they're called that. They're supposed to be centred as literally as possible for preference around a single symbol. They can do other things like entertain, amuse, even frighten, but the first thing they have to do is provide channel identification, and a lot of them these days don't. Or at least don't bother sorting that part out before going on to the other bits. Channel 4 at least has the giant to provide something resembling a symbol, although they did only make 4 of these, so they got old fast. Channel 5 doesn't even have that much. There's a set of bland films involving 5 of something. Insanely, they actually do have a symbol that they spent millions on and don't even use in their idents. Even Channel 4 allude to theirs. BBC 2's new idents are a single locked-off shot of an abstract pattern placed directly in the centre of the picture. They identify. And if you're looking for a symbol, it's right there at the bottom. This is what both elevates the new look BBC 2 above channels 4 and 5 and provides the new idents with their only real flaw of any note. It's the same logo type before, with the word 2 in wreath sans consistently picked out centre bottom in white. Against the paler backdrops, it disappears. It's bland and not especially intuitive. I understand that you don't want it to be too interesting because the curve and its abstract animations are ultimately the point, but they could at least have put a shadow behind it so you could see the damn thing. That's really the only quibble I have, however. The new BBC 2 idents are now officially the best idents on television, and a brilliant compromise between a recognisable symbol and the ambient stupid that's so popular these days. And it means we'll get a new Christmas ident this year, which will inevitably stay for the next 4 or 5 years, if any, but still. Now if only we could get a new look BBC 1. I have my own ideas about that. They're not anywhere near as good as this, but they're better than the current real thing.